Hello, my name is Josh DeVincenzo, and I am with Columbia University Climate School, specifically the National Center for Disaster Preparedness here in the United States. And thank you all for tuning into this video of my Ignite Stage presentation. So for the next 15 minutes, I'm going to be discussing community disaster financial literacy, building resilient communities around the globe. And this theme goes hand in hand with the idea and the cross-cutting theme of this year's platform on leaving no one behind. So if we can carve out the next few minutes to really think about the financial literacy in policy and practice and education in all of our different contexts, I think it will go a long way. So I work as a research associate, a senior instructional designer, and a lecturer at Columbia University's Climate School. And I'm happy to have the opportunity to be able to discuss years of work that have gone on at this intersection of financial literacy and disasters. So there are a few aims that I'm looking to achieve by the end of the presentation. And if anything, it's just some takeaways in which we can extend our thoughts and extend our work. But I do want to identify some key elements of financial literacy, including critical components to what we can do prior to a disaster. I would like to recognize ways to coordinate different long-term and intermediate plans amongst community partners and identify elements of a personal and organizational economic recovery plan, again, relying on public, private, and volunteer agencies in our communities. So first and foremost, we have to really look critically at the definitions that we use for financial literacy. Financial literacy is by no means a new concept. For a long time, these concepts have been tied to financial institutions and the services and products that they provide. When we tie it into the intersection of disasters and financial literacy, we see this definition becomes all the more important. Financial literacy in the US by the President's Advisory Council on Financial Literacy defines it as the ability to use knowledge and skills to manage financial resources effectively for a lifetime of financial well-being. In blue sky or normal times, this becomes quite rudimentary in many ways. But when we think about disaster context and disaster survivors and their financial needs, we see it's far more complicated than that our disaster scenarios, our disaster experience and research needs to be incorporated into the financial literacy definition. Financial education, again, going back to those historic roots of financial literacy, is referring to those products, those processes, the services and concepts. But really importantly here in the bold in the second bullet is where I want to focus. This becomes more of the universal principles, the foundations that we want to focus on. And that's the empowerment to make informed decisions, choices, avoid pitfalls, know where to go for help, which becomes very important in understanding recovery options, take other actions to improve their present and long-term financial well-being. So this one is the one that I want to run with for today's focus and really frame where we're going with the conversation in this talk, focusing on that empowerment, focusing on that long-term financial well-being, understanding all the hazards that may be and what we can do to empower small businesses, to empower individuals and households to think about finance in terms of a mitigation strategy. Financial literacy is twofold. We can be looking at it on the macro, which I'm sure at this platform, we're going to see plenty of examples of, thinking through fiscal policy, thinking through monetary policy, economic trends. But on the micro financial literacy aspects that oftentimes doesn't get as much attention, takes into consideration personal finance, personal debt management, loss prevention, insurance coverage, things that we can talk about and which can empower the financial well-being as we saw on the previous slide. Focusing on what we've done, and I'm really excited to share years of experience in which we've been out in the field working on economic recovery and financial literacy curriculum, sponsored and funded through the United States Federal Emergency Management Agency, better known as FEMA, where as Columbia Climate School, we are out in the field with states around our country, tribes and territories, working and workshopping these themes of financial literacy because there has been so much more attention to this space from emergency managers, from disaster planners, from the small business community, the large business community. We're seeing this need to empower businesses, to empower individuals and households through mitigation planning, through preparedness, and of course, through recovery. So you can see here, it's been a tremendous few years on this program. Several of our states covered here and still growing, but everything that we learn from the individuals that we're working with frames our thought, frames the urgency around financial literacy. And I'm happy and glad to have the opportunity to share many of those findings here on the stage. And while more of what we'll see in the recommendation section at the end here. A little bit more about the program in which we are part of. Through FEMA, this curriculum block, this curriculum initiative is completely sponsored by them. It comes to no direct cost to the local partners that we work with. So we are able to really get into the communities, really talk about these different aspects of individual personal finance and financial literacy, but then also more of their citywide, statewide, and even nationwide concerns around finances and disasters. So in the United States, we do have the National Disaster Recovery Framework. These are some of the 8 principles, and you can see highlighted as top of the list is first individual and family empowerment. Sometimes we'll get the follow-up question, what does that specifically mean? And of course, in the context of today's presentation, we are really looking at those themes of personal finance, personal empowerment. But you can see the whole list here of very important things that are somewhat interrelated, but at the forefront, individual and family empowerment. If we're not considering their financial well-being, the social net, the social supports required for disaster preparedness and recovery, then we're really truly missing the mark on our disaster recovery frameworks. It all comes down to the fundamentals. And this is one approach in which that we have had some success in explaining disaster financial literacy. And I encourage all folks to take this and recycle this if this is something that can meet your needs. It's not necessarily that policy literacy, although it becomes very important, but more so just the tendency, the cash flows, whether we're talking about US dollars, a different currency, understanding this dynamic relationship, both from a policymaker standpoint, but then even a head of household who's thinking about personal finances. We lay out the famous accounting equation where we're looking at assets, liabilities, and equity. And we walk people through, we walk our learners through the dynamic relationship of this. Assets being what someone owns, liabilities being what someone owes, and equity being what's left over after you subtract liabilities from assets. But liabilities become those debts. They become what you owe in terms of credit, in terms of just any expense that is currently not something you own. We're really thinking about that in terms of liabilities. You can see this blue triangle, or this bottom base triangle here, is somewhat balanced. And this is a typical household or business dynamic where there's a little bit of debt. There's a little bit, and again, whatever we're thinking about this more fundamentals. So we're not putting a specific currency to it, a specific economy to this. But there's some elements of debt. There's some elements of assets. There's some elements of equity, and there's a pretty balanced triangle. But what we know is when disasters occur, and when we go into more of these gray sky states, these liabilities shoot up. These liabilities, and you can see that portrayed with the arrow going up and the red triangle. They go up. And unfortunately, for so many people around the world, that triangle never comes back into balance. The more liabilities that existed prior to the disaster and prior to having these discussions about disaster financial literacy, the more and rapid that this triangle is going to go up in the liabilities. Uniquely and really important to note is that when these liabilities go up, you see at the edges of the triangles, the assets, the equity, again, what we own and what's left over, they're caving in because they're becoming less and less. Our goal when we think about disaster financial literacy, the preparedness side, the risk reduction side, is we want to bring this triangle down. We want to bring that top angle of this triangle back into balance. But we do know, and we want to acknowledge, that takes time, and that's going to be case by case, business by business, family by family, individual by individual. But this is something that can help us to get the conversation started. It's a nice visual in which we can conceptualize the realities of what happens to personal finances after a disaster. Going into why this is important, you've seen this theme come up a couple of different times through debt management, through that liabilities triangle. This is an example from the United States, the Small Business Administration. And some of the most frequent reasons that applications for individuals as well as businesses are declined. You can see it at the top of the list is unsatisfactory credit history. So really touching upon that liabilities piece. And then the second one being lack of repayment ability, looking really at that assets equity pieces. So it really does come back to those fundamentals that I do think are a great starting place to understand the realities of post-disaster financial recovery. Now, looking at it in the more global sphere and very specific to this platform, looking at the Sendai Framework, we can see here the 4 priorities on the right. So you have the 4 priorities. I circled what I think is the most relevant for disaster financial literacy. While you're listening through this presentation, light bulbs might be going off in terms of other ways that it relates to the Sendai Framework or your own goals or your own frameworks. But you can see equipping people with disaster financial literacy directly addresses that investing in disaster reduction for resilience. Looking at the social support. So if we are looking at a mitigation strategy, and we'll use an example of managed retreat in a few moments, and buyout programs where we're buying up a heavily exposed and heavily vulnerable land and bringing it inland, or doing very policy related program specific moves for mitigation. What that means in terms of making sure that there are financial supports for folks that do participate in that, or people that do participate in that. On the left here, you can see some of the different goals that are set out. So if we equip disaster financial literacy, we're directly addressing reducing the number of affected people globally. We are reducing the direct economic loss in relation to GDP, especially with the disaster financial literacy for businesses. If we can better prepare our businesses with continuity operations for business continuity management, we can see a reduction in the direct economic loss in relation to GDP there. If we can increase the number of countries with a national and local disaster risk reduction strategy that incorporates individual and household and business financial literacy, we'll see kind of that ripple effect and that interrelated effect go on across these goals in the context of the Sendai framework. What this looks like in just a typical organizational continuity preparedness plan, you can see that we can't address organizational preparedness without looking at our community preparedness. And if we're looking at our community preparedness, we need to focus on our individuals and families preparedness. This idea of including individuals and households, as well as business and preparedness strategies in financial literacy conversations, in our investment conversations, becomes a strategic move across organizations. And sometimes it takes this org chart in which to see that explicitly. But why this image becomes very important is when we think about the program design, program implementation of something like this, and some directions ahead, looking both at our disaster recovery framework in the United States, but also the Sendai framework, we need collaboration across these 3 groups to truly understand the lived experience of individuals and households that are impacted, their finances are impacted, and of course their decision making, empowerment, and well-being is also impacted. Some recommendations and next steps for where do we go from here. This comes from a lot of our research that looks at the intersection of disaster financial literacy and some of the different programs in the United States, one specifically being the buyout program, which I mentioned earlier we would come back to. My recommendations here is and this again can be, needs to be contextualized for the communities that you're working with. But what I can say from the United States standpoint, for most US households, short-term financial priorities and burdens take precedence over understanding the long-term benefits of climate mitigation strategies, let alone how to finance them. When it comes to talking about their personal finances, their financial strategy, it is a very sensitive topic. It's sensitive because there are many stressors associated to these short-term financial priorities, whether it's rent, whether it's childcare, and the list goes on and on. And again, we need to contextualize this. However, the decision-making process, that long-term empowerment piece, becomes more and more complex when thinking about long-term benefits of climate mitigation strategies, when we have so many concerns right now, right here. Communication of mitigation strategies or risk reduction strategies. We need to think about this very critically. We need to have transparency required to provide confidence in the benefits, the logistics, and the concerns that households might have about long-term well-being. We take the buyout program as an example, where if we do ask someone to relocate, if someone is individually displaced, do we have programs in place that can support them, not only for the first 2 years of displacement, but for the long term? And we need to really think about what we can do across research, what we can do across policy, and get it reflected in practice that takes into account the individual and household financial considerations. We appeal, of course, to policymakers, researchers, and educators to consider this convergence as very important, looking at financial literacy alongside climate adaptation to better support community level preparedness for relocation as well as disaster risk reduction. One strikingly difficult barrier that I would love to encourage the global community here to be thinking about is the longitudinal data. We need to begin looking at if the program is in place to provide cost recovery for individuals and households, for businesses. If we have a buyout program in place, we need to really begin tracking this longitudinal data because we have a very incomplete understanding of because we have a very incomplete understanding of overall household financial preparedness as a result of not having this longitudinal data. Lastly, and a very important point, and one that I hope spurs the conversation, thinks through innovative ideas, contributes to this platform, especially when we think about COVID-19 recovery in the context of compounding disasters. No single program that I'm aware of that is out there is capable of giving households enough of a safety net in terms of their finances to go unaffected from a climate emergency. And there might never be one. But what we need to really think about is what can we do across sectors, across different groups to look at the individual and household supports after a disaster, understanding that a program might not necessarily make a household whole again, but are there partnerships out there? Are there new program designs? Are there new ways in which we can be proactive about this that we can address and work on together? I want to thank everybody for your attention. This is my contact information. If you're interested about our curriculum on financial literacy, on community economic recovery, we are always happy to engage in those conversations. Columbia Climate School is a place in which we can begin to generate those ideas alongside partners worldwide. And of course, as you may have taken from this talk, the importance of this subject and the importance of this intersection is something that I truly am passionate about and would love to advocate for in whatever context makes the most sense. So thank you for your time, and I hope to hear from you and hope to generate some new ideas from all the different presentations that are going on at this wonderful, wonderful platform.